I've been a real bad boy on the town all night. Starting to calm down with the morning light. I'm in the dirt, down in the dirt. Been real bad boy. I've been a real bad boy on the town all night. Starting to calm down with the morning light. I'm in the dirt, down in the dirt, down in the dirt, down in the dirt, down in the dirt.
This has been a crazy week, and today has been a crazy day to end a crazy week. So I'm looking forward to having a good stream today. Hopefully, everybody out there has got their beverage of choice today. I've got a little Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit single barrel bourbon, which somebody asked me about it the other day. I had it on my shelf. They're like, "How is that?" I was like, "I don't know. I've never really tried it." So I figured I would give it a shot here today, and you got to be able to try them. But we don't buy bourbon for looking. We buy bourbon for drinking. So today I've got an interesting topic. This one is one that has come up kind of recently, kind of out of the blue a little bit. It's frustrating a little bit for me because I try to make sure I'm putting out useful information and content for merchants out there, particularly around Magento 1. So one of the things that I've said that others have said is that your site's not going to quit working at the deadline, at the end of life from Magento. And so, we've had some information come up that's putting that a little bit at jeopardy. And so, we don't have any real clear answers yet, but I'm trying to get you some. So today I thought I would, go out, let's reach out to our payment provider partners, see who wants to come on and discuss this problem and see if we can't shed a little insight and get your questions answered. So I've got a few questions lined up, but really, as always, it's about your questions. So pile those things in the chat. We're live on LinkedIn and YouTube, and we'll be looking for those questions and try to get those answered. But first, as always, this live stream is brought to you by Mage Mojo. So I'm going to run this Mage Mojo commercial so it, helps pay for this nice Wild Turkey. I can't even say Wild Turkey Kentucky Spirit. Can't even say it. So, but we're going to run the commercial because Mage Mojo paid for it. So here we go. The following broadcast is sponsored by Mage Mojo. And I want to take a minute and talk about Magento hosting, because Magento hosting is a lot like hauling stuff in my Tundra here. It's about having a tool that is sized properly for the job. This Tundra's great if I'm on the farm and I want to tow something like my old pickup truck here. But what if I wanted to tow something bigger, like, say, a space shuttle? Well, then this just isn't the right tool for the job.
We know this because Toyota did it. This is a publicity stunt to show how awesome this truck is. And sure, it's pulling it, but look at how slow it is. Those people on foot are literally having to slow down to not pass this thing.
And that's a lot like Magento in that you need a proper hosting environment. I've been doing Magento as long as Magento's been doing Magento, and in all of that time, I've never seen somebody who can build a site to overcome improper hosting. And with increasing customer demands, slow is just not acceptable.
Mage Mojo understands the needs of Magento merchants because they focus only on Magento hosting, and they've built a reputation as a premier Magento hosting provider. They've built an incredible Magento cloud hosting platform so that their customers enjoy the speed, reliability, and scalability of cloud servers. And if you geek out about technical details, ask them about how they provide automatic horizontal scaling for free. With cloud hosting from Mage Mojo, there's no more worrying about flash sales or Cyber Monday traffic. If you operate a Magento store, then you need to check out Mage Mojo Hosting. The link is in the description of this live stream, or you can just go to magemojo.com. That's Magemojo.com.
Well, it did kick to me. It kicked to a blank screen. I don't know what's up with that, but we'll figure that out later. You know, it's a live stream. We have technical glitches. But if you would, welcome to the stream, Jeff Kohl from APS Payments. Jeff, if you would, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about APS Payments.
Of course.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, here we are. Thanks for having me. And, you know, before I get into that, I saw you had an old Ford truck, and I'm a Ford guy, so I got an old 73. So that was
Nice.
never cool, TJ. Jeff Kohl, I'm Executive Vice President of Sales for APS Payments, and we specialize in integrations, really ERP, e-commerce integrations with our APS Pays payment gateway. So that's what we do as a company, and we work through all the different partners that develop and sell different software packages to provide us an integrated payment solution.
All right, so if you would, we're just going to get right into the meat of it here with this. You know, there's been a couple of announcements. There was one, from Visa a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago, kind of talking about some of the problems with Magento 1 post end of life. And then this past week, a lot of merchants received a notification from PayPal, in that same line. Could you maybe, start off with talking about what's the problem with taking payments on a platform that's no longer supported?
Yeah, so there's a pretty clear rule that Visa has had in place for quite some time, and it's Rule 6.2, and it states that if you're using a third-party software, you need to have security patches in those updates. So when that third-party provider decides we're no longer going to do those security patches, that is from Visa's perspective a violation to one of their rules, right? So. And the Rule 6.2 is the one that everyone should be looking at, because those security patches are no longer going to be supported from a Magento perspective. And then that's where the problem really ultimately lies.
Now, what's the difference between the notification that came out from Visa and the one that came out from PayPal?
Well, it's interesting because as an acquirer, and you'll see this right underneath that rule, it states it's imperative that the actual acquirers are also cognizant of this issue and this problem and not supporting those particular merchants. So as an acquirer, if I'm not following those Visa guidelines, I can get fined fairly significantly. And there are some issues around that. We don't want to lose the ability to acquire because we're not following those rules. So when PayPal sends out that notice, they're ultimately protecting themselves, but following those Visa guidelines at the end of the day. And that's incumbent upon us as a merchant service provider to follow those guidelines. So when that is put out back in July, or it was April, we all had to look at that, and we have existing M1 merchants as well, and we've got to make a very hard decision on those particular merchants, which is unfortunate.
If you would, just make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. Could you clarify what an acquirer is? Sure.
So as a merchant service acquirer, we basically work with funding banks, and most acquirers will work with a funding bank that actually underwrites, acquires the account, is in essence funding that account. And typically it's next day, and then they recoup those dollars from Visa, MasterCard as far as interchange and things of that nature. So banks in essence view it as a short-term loan. So we're in essence acquiring those merchant accounts. In the instance of PayPal, they act as the acquiring bank, so they have a little bit more flexibility, but still they have to adhere to Visa guidelines at the end of the day, right? And that's what's important here.
So you're saying this notification from PayPal was prompted by Visa. Like the notification that we saw a few weeks ago was to folks like PayPal, like yourself, and then this notification is a result of that. They're basically trying to cover themselves in case there's a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to do the same thing. It's important that we adhere to those Visa rules and guidelines. That's the critical part. It puts our business in jeopardy as well if we're not following those guidelines. But I think the one thing to keep in mind here is ultimately where's that line drawn, right? From a security patch update perspective. So there's providers that will offer those patches through a hosting platform, and you're aware of those providers, and they will take the place of the Magento security patches. And I don't know how long they'll be able to sustain that, but there are some options with that. But the question becomes now, is Visa saying, oh, that's fine, that'll take the place of this guideline, and it satisfies our rules? I think those are the questions that ultimately need to be asked to Visa. The other thing that you got to think about is, how is that payment provider ultimately integrating into that shopping cart? Because there's really four main ways to integrate. And let's talk about those four main ways really quick. And what is the security implication around those ways of integrating? So the first one would be a direct post, which has the lowest security parameters to it. And that's where you're basically embedding right into the shopping cart or respective software that you're integrating the payment gateway into. The next one is a three-step redirect, which you're kind of directing away from the website, and you're using a product called Verified through Visa and MasterCard to verify that transaction. That raises another security level, but still there's card data that can be accessed through the shopping cart in that type of environment or integration. Then there's a collect.js integration model, which does a pop-up. There's another level of security, so it pops up when you actually enter your credit card information. So it takes it away a little bit from the actual website, because it tokenizes the credit card, and that's extremely important, tokenization. And we can touch on that as well. And then the fourth way is really, it's called collect checkout or hosted form. And in that environment, you are literally hosting the actual page where they're inputting the credit card, going to the next phase, and that is being hosted with the gateway, and it's fully secure. So in that environment, no card data is touching the website at all. So with that form of integration, does that ultimately skate that rule with Visa? That's the question that has to be asked to Visa, is if no card data at all is passing my M1 site or my shopping cart, and it's all being housed on the secure gateway and following Visa protocols and rules, does that skate the rule, and are we okay to continue to maintain that M1 site? I mean, that's probably a question the Magento community would want to ask Adobe or Visa, ultimately. And maybe Magento should ask that question as well. What are those rules to ultimately take care of those customers that can't migrate over because they can't absorb that cost, or they've invested too much into their M1 platform? Those are the questions that need to be asked and answered ultimately.
No, the problem there, though, and we've got a few questions in the chat. They're great questions. We're going to get to them. They were questions I was going to ask anyway, so keep those questions coming. We're going to get to those in just a second when we finish this line of thinking. The problem is like, for a merchant or for an agency or for a community, who do we ask? Mm-hmm. Like, we don't have the pull that an Adobe is going to have to go out and get answers for that. So, if they're like, you're on your own, which they may not, I'm not saying they're going to do that, but if they do say, this is not our problem, we've told you, you've had years, then who do we go to? Like, where at Visa, who am I applying to? What email am I sending? What phone number am I calling to get an answer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And will you get an answer? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, really. We don't necessarily deal a whole lot with Visa and MasterCard directly, right? Because we're on the acquiring side. I guess if you're in the issuing side, issuing actual credit cards, that would be a different relationship. So who you actually asked, after this, we started talking about this quite a while ago, and it's probably something that I didn't realize was going to be end of life so quickly, and there was going to be huge implications, because this announcement came out 2 months ago. And we do have clients on M1, but who do you ask? I don't know. I'm going to have to look into that. I would assume there's a legal department at Visa that we can voice that question to specifically and outline those different integration, the different ways to integrate, as well as what those hosting companies are doing as far as updating security patches. And will those two different things, a hosted platform as far as the payments are concerned, and a third party providing security patches on that existing M1 site, does that satisfy those rules? I think is ultimately the question that has to be asked. And TJ, I don't really know exactly who you would ask, but I'm sure we're going to do some research after this to figure it out, so we can provide some answers around that. I think that's important.
Yeah, just on that same thread, a couple of questions in the chat that touch on that, because Igor on LinkedIn is asking, what if the community or third-party developers provide these security patches? Would that solve the problem for PayPal and Visa? Just curious, how strict is this rule we're talking about? It's a great question, Igor. The thing is, in my opinion, if you take Magento 1 and you then apply the latest version of OpenMage or Mage One or whatever, third-party support system you're trying to provide, you are no longer on Magento One. You are now on OpenMage, because you can't just move in between them freely if they're releasing things differently, at least not without substantial work. So you're not on Magento One anymore. You're on OpenMage. So what if, in your opinion, I know these are just opinions at this point, we're still trying to get a lot of, factual, solid answers. But in your opinion, if they are providing third-party support for a platform like this, do you think that gets past these restrictions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It is my opinion. So I don't, this isn't the opinion of of APS Payments or Repay for that matter. It sounds to me like it does, ultimately, because you are not storing the security patches part. Yes, because that's really the rule. Is there third-party security patches? Are you installing them within 1 month? Because that's the parameter, right? And so as long as you're doing that, to me, it sounds like you're satisfying those requirements. The other side is if it's a hosted payment integration where no card data is touching that shopping cart, does that also solve their requirements? It sounds like it does to me. It just makes sense logically because there is no card data being stored in that environment with that integration technique. So I think the answer is yes. But then the second follow-up, conversation to that is, what was the conversation, and was there a conversation ultimately between Magento, Adobe, and Visa to put this notice out? And my concern is, was this just a push to say, let's not go through all the different ways that you can integrate. Let's not look at third-party hosting platforms that can do security patches. Let's just release this because we want to get everyone off of M1, right? Now I'm speculating, that's a speculation and kind of a conspiracy theory, but Adobe, I'm sure, has some pull, right? Obviously, it's a fairly well-known company, publicly traded. And do they have pull with Visa? What were those conversations like? Or did Visa, find this out and determine, okay, we need to get everyone off of M1, right? So what did that dialogue look like between Visa and Magento ultimately? I don't think we'll ever get the answer to that, but it's a concerning question, right?
Absolutely. And I want to pull up and read a portion of the PayPal message. And I'm sorry for not having this pulled together ahead of time, but at the end of PayPal's message, they mentioned what action is required. And the action was contact your customer success manager immediately to ensure we are engaged, understand your migration timelines, and are able to provide assistance where possible. So, with that, and then they follow up with, you will need to migrate to either the Magento 2 platform, to PayPal merchants, Braintree merchants, and of course my message is cut off there. But, is this a sales opportunity? Like that's, it's one of those where people need to get off Magento 1. Make no bones about it. You need to long-term get off of Magento 1. But is this, especially during a time when sales pipelines are, from what I hear, fairly dry for most folks because of the current state of the world, is this an opportunity to maybe fill those coffers a little bit?
Well, yeah, of course it is. I think before we go down that sales question, we've got to look at the businesses that are ultimately on M1, right? Of course, there's opportunity for some of the other e-commerce providers to swoop up those customers ultimately. And I think you had given me a stat. It was about 100,000 smaller merchants still on M1. Is that a correct number?
That's what a lot of people are saying based on built with lists, is that there are at least 100,000 still Magento 1 sites still out there. How many are active? We don't really know.
Yeah, and there are other shopping carts out there. So I think from a merchant perspective, you look and you say, okay, how am I being supported? What is the dialogue between Magento and myself, or the development community in Magento, and how have I ultimately been treated through this transition, or this forced to transition, right? And what are they doing to help through that transition from a Magento perspective? And I think what starts to happen from a business perspective is you start to think, well, they weren't taking care of me very well, so I'm going to look for other options, other opportunities, and other platforms that I can ultimately use. So the answer is yes. There's a huge sales opportunity, not only in developers and e-commerce providers, but also for payment providers, right? To be able to talk about the way that they integrate into these other platforms. From a PayPal perspective, they have multiple ways to integrate. They have PayFlow Pro, Braintree, they have other gateways, and they have a direct API for PayPal payments. So, for them, they're just trying to retain those customers, I would assume, and make sure that they're available during that migration. But I think the bottom line is they're just following Visa guidelines, and it's prudent from any processor's perspective to say, we want to help through that migration, but ultimately, what can a payment provider do when it comes to an e-commerce platform, right? We're just integrating and providing the payment solution for that particular provider, and as much our particular merchant, as much information around how that integration works, and actually supporting that integration, deploying and implementing it. That's all that we can ultimately do. Now, one of the things to think about is if you are migrating to a new payment provider, and you have an integration currently on M1 that supports credit card tokenization, if you're moving to a new gateway, you are no longer storing those token IDs. So the customer is going to have to re-enter. So does that impact your customer experience? I also think it's a great opportunity for merchants to reevaluate their entire business, especially with COVID and what's going on. Not only look at their website, but look at their warehouse management, their supply chains, all the different software that they're employing. I mean, I had a conversation with a merchant that has an issue with hiring AR, accounts receivable clerks, because they're getting paid more on unemployment, right? So now it's okay. Now we have to evaluate how do we automate AR, and so those are the things that, as a merchant migrating anyway and being forced to, they need to start evaluating all those different platforms and systems they're using, making sure that they integrate for data flow and making sure it's automated and it's easy for customers to ultimately pay and get their products. So I think that's the bigger picture of what these merchants need to look at. Now, can they afford all of that? I don't know, because lending is very strict now as well. So now you're going to have to use private equity to get lending because banks are leveraged to the hilt right now, and their lending is very difficult. So there's a lot of opportunity because you talk about sales. It's not just in developers on shopping carts and websites. There's a lot of opportunity around lending, around automation, around integration, payments. So this is going to open a lot of opportunity, and it's also going to create innovation. And I think that's what people need to be looking at from a business perspective, not just, oh my God, I'm being forced to move off of M1. Let's take this as an opportunity to really evaluate our business and start to streamline and be more efficient in everything that we do.
Well, it's one thing I want to make sure I touch on before we get into the questions in the chat. Got a lot of great questions there. The problem is we've got a matter of weeks. Like, you're not going to make a Magento 1 to Magento 2 or Magento 1 to anything migration in a few weeks if you've got any level of complexity, if you're doing serious e-commerce. And so, I'm hearing, but it's through the grapevine hearing, through good sources, but via the grapevine, that, PayPal or most of these service providers are not going to cut you off at the end of life. You just become a higher risk, and you don't really know what comes with being a higher risk long term. Is that are you seeing the same thing from APS? Is that kind of how the industry treats something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really specific to each company, but at the end of the day, we do have to follow those guidelines. So unless we have a clear answer from Visa on the two things we talked about, right, a third party supporting those security patterns after Magento stops, or using a hosted platform for payments, we have to determine how is that particular customer, what are they leveraging as far as those two technologies, and determine if that suffices those rules. But ultimately, if those two things do not satisfy, we're going to ultimately have to turn them off after a certain amount of time. How long is that time? I don't know. We've got to manage between the risk associated with that merchant as well as the risk associated with that rule and that guideline from Visa. So I think it's going to be specific to each individual company. But we're gonna probably keep them on as long as we can. But again, I'm not making that decision. That's being made at a corporate level, because now that we're publicly traded, I think we're probably going to have to adhere to that. And it's an unfortunate thing for those merchants, So if I was on M1 and I was a merchant and had a notice from PayPal, I would actively be searching multiple providers that would allow me to continue to process. I would also be making sure that I'm looking at those alternatives as far as an integration perspective with the hosted platform. And I would be looking at hosting that will do those security patches, because then you have an actual viable argument against that rule, right? But I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what that's going to look like. But ultimately, it's incumbent upon that merchant to make those decisions. And they've been told for quite a while. So as you know, they're being reactive instead of proactive. And that's when things go real wrong, because it takes forever and it's expensive to rebuild these platforms, right? You know that.
Definitely. All right, let's get to the questions in the chat here. Active Spin says, what about custom software? Are payment gateways just flat out not accepting payments from custom software? That's a great question, because technically, if you download Magento and you make one modification to it, you now own it. It's custom software, like it's yours. What's the difference in that and some software I built from the ground up in PHP?
Yeah, I mean, you still, even if you have custom software, there's still some requirements from a security and card data perspective, and it's really ultimately up to the merchant service provider to add those, right? And I think if it's, I have a custom software, one merchant is using it, typically we're adhering to security protocols already with our payment gateway and our API that integrates into any software, and we integrate into some custom platforms for multiple customers that we have, and we're still adhering to the Visa guidelines, right? So at the end of the day, they're not, Visa's not going to go audit one custom software and say, oh, you're not doing it right. But when there's a lot of customers on it, that's when it becomes a concern. That's when the risk level elevates significantly. So I mean, there's not a definitive answer to that, but it really is more about how many customers are on it and what is the risk exposure ultimately to the customers that I have on that platform, I think is the main question. And again, those are independent to each individual firm. But as long as you're using a gateway that has those security parameters in place, and there are some level one security things that are in place on payment gateways, like address verification and tokenization, in that environment, as long as it's integrated properly, again, there is no full card data being stored on that customized software. So I think what's important in that environment is that you're working with a payment provider that are following those guidelines to protect you, protect that provider, and ultimately protect your customers' card data, right? And as long as you're doing that, you should be fine.
Active Spin also had a question about tokenization. We kind of covered that there. If we didn't get that answered, let me know and we'll address that question directly. Eric Heilman in the chat. Eric, has Visa ever put out, quote, guidance ever before the way they did about Magento when end of life, or is this a first? Have they ever come out and said, hey, if you stay on this platform, you're in trouble, bro? Ever?
Not that I can recall that was specific to something like this. They make changes on the way that you integrate, and that's usually industry wide from a card data perspective. But I mean, we could probably search and find some examples of that, but not so widely publicized as M1 from what I've seen. And I've been in the industry for about 6 years now, and I haven't really seen that from my perspective. So it's just topic.
Eric in the chat says he agrees with the conspiracy theory. I think it was like, hey, Visa, we know you have problems with MageCart. You should put out guidance about M1 EOL because M2 doesn't have that problem. There's no way for us to say that, but it is odd that they've never done it before. And now here it is. Like it is a bit odd, to be sure. And most good conspiracy theories start with something that's just a little odd, right. True or false. Whether the conspiracy is a real deal, but I wished it would have happened 6 months ago.
Yeah, and I mean the reality is this happens with software. I mean, in ERP, we integrate into ERP platforms, and there's life platforms that are built in a way that it just doesn't really support security when it comes to card data. It gets very troubling when you see 16 digits of a card being stored locally on a platform. We as a processor have to make a decision to those merchants, and it happens in pretty much all the verticals that we integrate into. It's not happening as much because the integration methods that we're using are much more secure. But when you're doing like direct post integrations, which was readily done, years ago, there is some issues around that. So we have to make that decision when that software provider or that publisher says, we're no longer supporting this and there are some security issues around it. We also have to stop supporting that, from a guideline perspective and a rules perspective. So this isn't specific to Magento happening. It happens to all software. And, we had a conversation before about this. The maintenance continues, the enhancements continue. Everything that we integrate into consistently has software updates that we have to modify our integration to support that. And, besides additional functionality and enhancements, a lot of times there's additional security protocol that are added to that new enhancement of that software. And we have to, unfortunately, continue to modify our integration to support that. And that's ongoing. And I think that's the same case when it comes to e-commerce platforms, right?
Definitely. All right. Continuing to go through the chat here for questions. All right. About ActiveSpend, about this whole security patches thing, why is this a thing? If there's no vendor or you are the vendor, the whole patch idea makes no sense. I'm not sure I understand that question. Are you wondering why they're cutting support because there are no patches? Like what it is they are trying to limit their risk with stolen credit card data by forcing people to have some sort of plan for patches. Because you have to understand, a lot of merchants, for every merchant out there that has a ton of resources and developers in their pocket to do this by themselves, there are hundreds of thousands of merchants, or at least tens of thousands to merchants, to everyone that don't have those resources. And if they're on an unsupported platform, then they're just going to not do the patches. I mean, there are a ton of people out there right now that don't do the patches. So, I mean, I've talked to merchants all the time that are on 1.7 or something like that. And so they haven't even updated to the latest version of Magento 1. So it's always a problem. It's just now it's this huge organized problem that has drawn a target.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you got to think about when we talked earlier about the different ways to integrate, right? There are certain integration methods that will unfortunately have vulnerability when it comes to card data. And that usually comes when you're keying in your card or your 16 digits, right? And if that data is stolen and you are no longer considered PCI compliant as a firm, you can get fined significantly. And you've seen some of the breach fines with Target and some of the other large box stores. It is expensive. So could you imagine you have a Magento 1 website, you have a direct post integration with your payment provider, and maybe you have, over the course of 3 months, 1,000 customers come through, or a month for that matter, 1,000 customers come through, and all that card data is stolen. You're going to get fined for every single one of those cardholders' data being stolen. And it gets extremely expensive, to the tune of, it could be millions of dollars, and that's going to put you out of business pretty quick. So I think the unfortunate part of this is, I think they're looking at this as it's integrated in with a payment provider, card data can be stolen, and they're not really considering the different integration methods and kind of drawing that line, right? So they're just blanket saying, look, there's vulnerability, there's no more security patches, we are protecting cardholder data, you need to get off of it, without really looking at the entire picture. And that goes back to, a third-party hosted platform doing security patches. If it's integrated into hosted form or no card data is stored at the website at all, or even touches the website for that matter, does that actually satisfy those rules, and can we continue to process with our current provider? I think at the end of the day, that's the question that needs to be answered from a Visa perspective, And there hasn't been a separation from that. It's been blanketed. Here's the reality. Get off of Magento 1. It's no longer supported for Magento as far as security patches. It does not follow that 6.2 rule from Visa. You need to migrate off of it, and you have 2 months to do that. To me, it's kind of just a blanket statement without really looking at all those details, right? And saying, okay, here's the line that's drawn. If this, then you can't be on it. If this, you can be. If you're using a third party doing security patches, that's not Magento, that satisfies. And if you're using a hosted payment form, that satisfies. Will they draw that line? Probably not. Potentially, I don't know. That's really the question, I think, ultimately.
All right, continuing down the questions in the chat, I'm going to get a few more here on YouTube, and then I'll jump over on LinkedIn and get some of those as well. Active Spin says Sansec, SANSEC, says there's still 100,000 M1 merchants out there. And Eric Heilman mentions that SANSEC, Sansec, is more accurate than Built With, which has a many months lag, which I mentioned a little while ago. So that's where the numbers come from. Eric's question is, do you as a payment provider even know what software is sending the API requests? And if you don't, like, providers won't even know that M1 is sending the request. Like, do you know? If I just threw up an M1 site right now, signed up for an account and started transacting, you wouldn't even know, would you?
No, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know that at all. Sorry, I got a little ring on my thing. I wouldn't know that, because I'm not on the support side. So typically when we integrate and board a customer, that we're going to ask them what they're using, right? So if it's a new client and they say we're on Magento, we're going to ask what version of Magento are you on, because we integrate to both M1 and M2. If they tell us M1, we're going to have to tell them, sorry, we can no longer support M1. I mean, that's the reality. So if we are told that there's certain platforms that are no longer going to be supported with security patches, as a company, we have to make a decision to no longer support those merchants. We might support for a short amount of time the existing merchants on it, but we've got to evaluate that still. But if it's a new merchant, we're not going to even board that client. And that holds true with even point of sale systems. There's some old Microsoft retail management platforms that hold card data locally. We can't support that, even though we integrate, right? Because we know that there's an inherent risk with the way that API call is working when it comes to card data. So we are pretty stringent about that. We have to be, because we don't want to lose the ability to acquire merchant accounts at the end of the day.
But technically, is there a lot of difference between how you accept payments for M1 and M2? Like, if I was up to your M2 standards but rocking M1 and I just lied to you, you wouldn't know.
I can't even answer that question because I'm not in the development, integration, implementation team. But what I can tell you is, from an API gateway perspective, they're all the same exact calls for the most part. Zero validate to tokenize, you got your pre-authorization, your capture. There's different payment methods that customers are utilizing. There's scenarios where you do a pre-auth on a website, you pass that token with the order into your accounting or ERP platform, and then you capture that to adjust for shipping. There's different workflows when it comes to an e-commerce platform, but at the end of the day, all the API calls are in essence the same. So okay. We would probably not know that.
Active Spin's question is, tokenization equal PCI compliance? I mean, not necessarily, right?
No. All really, at the end of the day, it adds another level of security, right? And so what tokenization is you're not storing card data locally, you're just storing a token. And that token has the first digit, so we know it's a Visa, MasterCard, Discover, Amex, and the last four digits for a reference point with your merchant or the merchant or the customer that's actually interacting with your e-commerce platform. So they know, yeah, that's my card ending in these four digits. The full 16 digits in that environment is stored on our gateway, but it does not mean you're PCI compliant. There's a couple of things you have to do from a PCI compliance perspective. As a merchant accepting credit cards, on an annual basis, you have to submit what's called a self-assessment questionnaire. And they're going to ask you certain things like, are you currently getting security patches on your e-commerce platform? And they're very standardized as far as a questionnaire perspective, but you have to do that annually. Now, you don't want to lie on that, right? If you lie on that and you get found out, that's going to be some legal issues, right? And then you're going to lose the ability to even have a merchant account after that. The other thing is we have to do IP scans, and especially if you have a direct direct post integration, you've got to do rigorous IP scans to potentially find any vulnerabilities on your network. And if you're not doing that due diligence, you can get breached. You can get off shop, which is where someone has a bunch of stolen credit cards and they're just flowing it through your gateway. And if you don't have velocity numbers and implement at the gateway level, you're going to get crushed with a lot of money as far as transactional fees are concerned. I mean, we've heard of stories that are brutal. But ultimately, it's really incumbent upon that merchant to submit that SAQ to become compliant. If you do not become compliant on an annual basis and complete that SAQ and do your IP scans, you run the risk of holding all liability in case there is a breach, and you're not sharing any of it if you're non-compliant. So it's extremely important, just from a liability perspective, that you are PCI compliant.
A couple of mentions in the chat here. Last couple of things on YouTube, then I'm going to jump over to LinkedIn to get to those questions. Eric Heilman mentions you can pay to opt out of those scans. Is that true?
No. It depends on how you're integrated. There's scenarios where there's firms that do not do IP scans. We are rigorous about it. It's important that we expose any potential vulnerabilities in a network where we're actually running payments. So you don't want to opt out of those. That's for your protection. That's for the processor's protection. It's for the cardholder's protection. You want to protect your business. You want to protect your client's card data. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So opting out of IP scans is probably a bad idea.
But theoretically, with some payment providers, you may be able to do that.
That's independent to those payment providers and ultimately the business decision around that. Some of the smaller ones probably don't do that as rigorously as other providers, and those are internal decisions. But as far as the guidelines and the rules are concerned, you should be doing that.
Okay. Last question here on YouTube. I've never seen any merchant fined. I've never seen any merchant fined, and we see 2 to 3 infections a week for a long time. Like, how common is it for a merchant to actually be fined for some sort of violation?
Yeah, it's unless it's widespread, it's not super common because, I mean, ultimately they're going to do an investigation, and sometimes you'll be required to actually foot the bill on an investigation and get it done within a certain amount of time when there was an actual breach. But I think Visa ultimately wants to make sure that the customers are taken care of and they don't lose clients. But if you're completely negligent and it's pretty widespread, they don't want to publicize there's all these issues around protecting card data because that doesn't do anything good for the industry. And I don't have the answer to how many customers get fined. A lot of that is held privately. When it becomes public, it's usually the box stores, and it becomes newsworthy at that point.
Okay.
But I don't have a distinct answer.
I understand. So we're going to jump back over to LinkedIn and answer some questions there. Aaron in the chat there says Magento 2.1 was end of life in June 2019. 2.2 was EOL December 2019. Would a merchant on an older version of M2 be as at risk as an M1 merchant?
No, because those security patches are being updated. That will only happen when Magento decides no longer to support it and do security patch updates.
Well, I mean, if they've end of lifed Magento 2.2, technically they no longer support Magento 2.2, or at least they're not putting out new patches for it. So you would have to move to 2.3 to get those patches once 2.2 is end of life. So, technically the problem is from Visa's perspective, as long as the patches are available, you're good, regardless of whether or not you install them.
Right. Well, you have to install them within 30 days. That's the actual rule. Right?
Is that the actual rule? It's just an unenforceable actual rule. It's just data they can use against you if something happens and they want to hammer you.
Right. It's not a law. I mean, it's a
right.
Visa regulation, Visa rule at the end of the day. But the last thing you want to do is violate those rules and consistently do that because you think, oh, it's fine, everything's great, because you can eventually lose the ability to even have a merchant account. Can you imagine? Sure. You have a website that you're doing, a couple $1 million a month on, and all of a sudden you lose the ability to process. Well, guess what's going to happen? You're going to go to other acquirers, and if they're doing their due diligence, they're going to see that you're put on that, in essence, a blacklist of merchant accounts, right? So now you will no longer have the ability to have a merchant account. Now you're going to offshore. You're paying 4, 6, 10% on your merchant account just to get an offshore account, and that's nefarious, right, at the end of the day. And then you've got funding issues around that. So I mean, that would be a business ender, to, especially if you heavily rely on credit card processing, to lose the ability to accept credit cards. By the way, I've seen that happen, and it is not pretty. And those companies tend to have to sell, really do a lot of rigorous things to get off of that list, right? And there's times that you can get off of that list, but ultimately it's up to the acquirer to decide, okay, we can help take them off the list. And you've got to put some things in place to make sure you're adhering to those rules going forward. So all of this is just being prepared, plan for the worst and expect the best, I think is the motto here, right? Ultimately around card data. I think it's unfair to say, from a merchant perspective, and you're a business, if you're taking credit cards, it's incumbent upon you to protect your customers' credit cards. I mean, I've had my card stolen. I mean, it happened to be recently where at a gas station, someone somehow scanned my American Express. And, I was upset, American Express. Well, why aren't you? I actually called them, and this is the industry that I'm in. But at the end of the day, these things happen. But if you're not doing the due diligence as a business to protect that data because you just don't want to foot the bill or you want to skate it, that's a bad thing from a business perspective. You're not protecting your customers at the end of the day. That's my opinion on it. I think it's important.
No, definitely. It's definitely the right thing to do. We're just trying to explore the fringes of, what these requirements mean, just to make sure people have options, because we've got weeks at this point to figure it out.
Yeah.
But you're right. Yeah, the right thing to do is to move your ass off Magento 1. Like, that's the right thing to do. But if you can't do that right now, let's talk about the other scenarios.
Well, TJ, think about this, and I don't know what has the dialogue been from Magento to that 100,000 say customers. What does that interaction look like? What does that support look like? And this is ultimately, it's an open source platform. It's a community. So I know on this is really incumbent upon that merchant to do that shift, and they've known about that, right? But now that this rule came out and this announcement from Visa 2 months ago, a lot of these merchants were probably saying, I'll deal with it later. Let's go another year on it. That's fine. Now this guideline comes out from Visa, and it's like, oh no, right? I've known about this, but I didn't realize it was going to be this serious. So now they're being reactive. So ultimately, what's the community doing? What's Magento doing to help that transition financially, support-wise, communicating effectively? I don't know, but what does that look like from last couple of months?
The problem is, the thing is I don't know how many of that Visa notifications actually went to merchants, right? Like the PayPal definitely went to merchants, but the Visa one, don't know. So the PayPal notice may literally be the first time they're aware that they may be in problem territory when it comes to taking payments. Now, they knew the platform was ending support, but the messaging from most of us, me included, has been it's not going to end. It's not a switch they're going to flip and your site's going to shut off. It's open source software. You've downloaded it. It's on a host. It's going to keep working. And so with that, a lot of merchants, just because that it's the right thing to do, doesn't mean you're in a financial position to do it, right? And so, there are a lot of merchants that they did Magento years ago when it was dirt cheap. Like, you could find developers locally that could build a decent site on Magento for a few grand, and now you've got a Magento site that you've barely been spending any money on. You've been hosting for $50 a month. We're not necessarily talking about the guys that are doing 10 million a year plus. We're talking about people that are doing hundreds of thousands of dollars on the low end, maybe, up through that. There are some bigger players that are still on M1 that have customized sites that haven't invested the money, but those people theoretically should be sophisticated enough or have the revenue to overcome it. But how many of these are small merchants that don't is the real concern.
Yeah, I mean, that is the main question, right? And it's a scary proposition because with what's going on with COVID and everything else, I mean, that's had a tremendous impact even on our customers. We have a good number of hotels and restaurants, and they've been crushed by this unless you're a pizza delivery place. But yeah, how do they absorb that cost? And if their sales have significantly gone down in this new environment that we're in, I mean, I foresee a lot of these businesses going away, unfortunately. The other question is how much do these companies rely on their e-commerce platform to drive revenue? I think they have to evaluate that from a business perspective and say, how long can we last without a website to regain capital to rebuild it? Because as well as I do, it's not going to be done in 2 weeks. This could take 3 months, a year. It takes a long time and a fairly significant capital expense to build out a new e-commerce platform, especially in this day and age. So I think those are the things that you have to evaluate is, man, can I live without my e-commerce platform? And if that's the case, do I leverage Amazon? Do I leverage other platforms? Send out an email to my customer base and say, hey, now you can buy my product on Amazon. Now you're giving a margin to Amazon in that environment. Those are the decisions you have to make. What is the interim solution? I think that's independent to each business as they evaluate how important their e-commerce platform is, what their profit margins on, and can they leverage a third party to do those sales for them, right? Or can they absorb the cost of building out a new website? Those are all questions that every one of these companies I'm sure are looking at. But at the same time, you can't get caught up in the anger around it, right? And say, oh, I'm so mad, Magento, I'm going to raise a stink. I think we have to be innovators from a payment side, from a development side, from a hosting side. We've got to innovate solutions and ultimately find a way around this temporarily as they're making that migration over the next 6 months or whatever that looks like, right?
Yep. All right, we've got quite a bit of chatter in the chat. I want to make sure we get through all of this. We had planned to go about 8 more minutes. Do you have a few extra minutes if we need to get through these questions?
Sure.
Okay. So Igor in the chat mentioned from the 4 types of integrations you covered earlier, is there one that payment integration should be using? Which one is the best?
Well, I mean, the hosted form is, in my opinion, the best because you're hosting the actual where you put in the credit card, that page where the customer fills in their credit card, their payment information. That's all being hosted in conjunction with the payment gateway. So none of the card data is ultimately touching the website at all. And that holds true with any integration that you write, whether it's e-commerce or accounting or ERP. That hosted platform is the best way to integrate because none of that card data is being stored on that software or hitting that software for that. And I think that is in essence. Now it's more complex. And from a gateway perspective, you have to have software and hosted forms that are fairly robust from a UI perspective. But from security level, that is ultimately the best way to integrate.
All right, we've got Alan Kent say he likes solutions where credit card does not get typed in, like wallets like PayPal, Google Pay. Disclaimer, he works for Google.
Okay.
So no bias at all, according to Igor there. Alan's question here, if you could redesign the web, how do you think payments should be done to avoid these problems?
Well, just what I talked about, the hosted platform, right? But
if you could re-architect the whole thing, though, like completely, and I think that the examples he gave was, what about like if it's browser-based payments, or he even mentioned retina scans? Like, what is the next evolution of payments for the web?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't think it's ultimately going to be a payment provider that comes up with this. I think it's going to be a really sophisticated developer that builds it and then sells it to a payment provider ultimately. Retina scans is interesting. How do you facilitate that? You look at Apple Pay, and there's our gateway supports Apple Pay and an e-commerce platform. And you look at these different alternative payment methods, and even in a face-to-face environment, contactless payments is probably something we're going to see more iteration of. But from an e-commerce perspective, tokenization